The Vietnam War, even though lost to a pulp, has become something romantic for the United States thanks to movies. But how was it really? Now is the time to delve into the issue. Do you want to learn about Project 100, which is considered the most shameful in American history? Learn about drug prices in Vietnam and find out what soldiers felt. That's what we'll do in the next couple of minutes. And our new friend Robert will help us. It's March 1968, and the Vietnam War is raging at full force. Robert has been on the front lines for 4 months, and even as a private, is considered higher up than some officers because experience in Vietnam mattered more than rank. It's not even about combat skills. When soldiers went to Vietnam to fight, they expected honest face-to-face battles with the enemy. As it turns out, you're probably well aware of the reality. Underground trenches, ambushes, Viet Cong in trees, and other perks of life that drove soldiers crazy, especially since the lion's share of recruits weren't prepared for anything like this. Our Robert was drafted involuntarily. Although there was no conscription in the US during conflicts, people were drafted into the military against their will. Most of those drafted for Vietnam were young men aged 18 to 20 who hadn't attended college or didn't have influential parents or jobs. However, not everyone was sent to Vietnam, even among them. The draft was partial. For example, in 1969, a draft lottery was held. Potential draftees were divided into groups, assigning numbers from 1 to 365 according to their birth dates. And then, discarding the unsuitable students, they drafted the groups in order. Eventually, before realizing that the endeavor was a failure, they even reached number 169. However, there were minor issues with the draft. 2/3 of soldiers went to Vietnam voluntarily. Only 1/3 were recruited in a mandatory manner. To illustrate the level of patriotism, you can look at World War II. The situation was reversed. Only 1/3 of soldiers were volunteers. As for our Robert, even when caught in the gears of the draft, he wasn't upset. Thanks to propaganda, every American believed they were going to Vietnam not to fight a hypothetical enemy, but to fight communism as a whole, and millions were willing to give their lives for it. So, Robert didn't worry one bit at the induction center. He was equipped with the latest technology, underwent a brief training, and was flown into Vietnam. The conditions on paper weren't bad at all. Even draftees could leave after a year of service, and even privates were paid $78 per month. In today's money, that's roughly around $1,000, considering that they were fed, hydrated, and provided with beds for free in the military. Isn't it, right? Unfortunately, only on paper. Once Robert arrived in Vietnam, he immediately felt the clutches of war. He was assigned as a machine gunner in the infantry corps, responsible for guarding the areas near Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam at that time. As you can understand, this was a prime target for North Vietnam. So, despite the relatively distant front location, it wasn't easy for Robert. Constant ambushes, guerrilla warfare, and even teasing from the civilian population quickly extinguished Robert's romantic enthusiasm. However, what bothered him even more was the state of the army in Vietnam. US generals didn't concern themselves with the morale of the soldiers. So, when someone from the squad died, they just sent a new person according to the residual principle. In other words, Robert joined an experienced team, often replacing deceased comrades. Well, you can guess that the unit's morale wasn't high. This was emphasized by the horrors happening all around. A typical day for Robert could look like this. The guys board a helicopter and fly to an area where rebels have been spotted, according to intelligence. However, it turns out the target is a village with civilians. The relaxed soldiers hand chocolates to children running towards them and blow up on grenades. Such situations were commonplace in Vietnam. Mothers calmly booby-trapped their own children. Sometimes they would suddenly take out guns and shoot the soldiers. As we explained in our video, the US intervention forced many South Vietnamese to switch sides and join their northern fellow citizens. Add a developed system of guerrilla warfare, and you get a situation where death could find Robert anywhere. Several facts immediately follow from this. The first is ruthlessness. Soldiers who survived for several months began to follow a rule formulated by Nick Turse: kill anything that moves. Tortured by attacks from civilians and soldiers, they often opened fire on civilians, killed children, and marked entire villages for bombing simply because they believed there were rebels there. The situation was insane, but it has an explanation. Robert, like all soldiers in Vietnam, was broken. According to statistics, 1 out of every 10 Americans was dying, and in 99% of cases it wasn't about fair fights. Mines, traps, ambushes by the civilian population. The Viet Cong threw everything into the fight, and Americans quickly broke, responding to the death of friends and kind. The most striking example of such ruthlessness by the Americans is the story of the village of My Lai. On March 16, 1968, 500 civilians were killed by U.S. soldiers. Among them were 173 children and 182 women. The reason? Someone thought the village was cooperating with the partisans. The details and precision have been erased by conflicting figures, but the outcome was a terrible war crime, for which only one lieutenant was officially condemned, but he was pardoned by the president by a personal decree the following day. This perfectly illustrates the message of American generals. They weren't just indifferent to killing civilians, they encouraged it, not out of cruelty but out of fear of rebellion and an unstable situation. In the United States itself, as you know, many demanded an end to the war, and our Robert and other soldiers, in turn, after a month in Vietnam, barely understood what they were fighting for. Days of death of friends colored everything the same, and with no end in sight, the madness did not hold back American deserters. Drugs. According to statistics, almost every other soldier used them. One of the nurses who worked in Vietnam for a year said that even medics were constantly high. What to say about the soldiers? Even officers didn't prohibit them from using drugs on duty. As you remember, a private salary was $78, and after 4 months of service, $83. So almost everyone could afford drugs. There were even rumors that the pills improved eyesight and hearing, instilling confidence in their abilities. In reality, as you understand, the American Army turned into a bunch of addicted junkies, and there were other rumors. For example, about a soldier from Chu Lai who killed a Vietnamese with a bayonet and then licked him dry. There were cases of shootouts even in the rear, where drugged soldiers had flashbacks, grabbed weapons, and opened fire on their own. Even if our Robert is a good guy, there's no guarantee he won't break. In Vietnam, there are no enemies. Civilians could turn out to be guerrillas. Friends die in droves and survivors eat pills and kill the civilian population with unimaginable cruelty. A great atmosphere, right? And perhaps the saddest part is that all of this was entirely encouraged by the top command. Presidents general did nothing to normalize the situation. On the contrary, they often rewarded killers of civilians, and propaganda even worked on the front lines. Robert still believed that he wasn't killing specific people, but communism. Throw in some pills, and you get that the typical soldier in Vietnam was an aggressive half-robot with washed brains. Sometimes not very smart either, because in 1966, due to a lack of soldiers, Defense Secretary McNamara officially lowered the requirements for draftees. This was the so-called Project 100,000, whose goal was to bring as many people into the Army as possible. On paper, it was believed that people who were psychologically, mentally, and physically unfit would get a chance to join the Army, receive training, and earn money. In reality, it turned into a disgrace. The 150,000 people recruited into the program were essentially dim-witted, cruel, and in some cases, illiterate. This is not a joke. Among the so-called New Standard people, 40% read worse than 6th graders, and 50% had an IQ lower than 85. These soldiers were often referred to as McNamara's morons by the general public. Statistically, they performed worse in every aspect. McNamara's morons died more often, deserted more often, and, most sadly, killed their own officers and comrades in battle more frequently. In the end, the program was recognized as a catastrophe, and mentions of it on the internet can be hard to find. But it didn't make things any easier for our Robert. At any moment, a similarly gifted guy could join his squad. The chances of surviving alongside such charmers were significantly reduced. And what's even sadder, even if Robert serves a year and returns home, life will continue to kick him. The U.S. protested against the Vietnam War, and often veterans were beaten, despised, and hated. No honors or discounts. Civilian life posed almost a greater threat to veterans, and for a moment, we're talking about people who went through the hell of drugs, death, and constant meat grinders. Fortunately, somehow most of them managed to cope. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans is only 1% higher than average. Even statistics on drug use after discharge among Vietnam veterans does not exceed the normal rates. According to statistics, 85% of veterans successfully found employment and had no problems. So if our Robert can return home, there's a greater likelihood that he will be fine. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about Vietnam. Out of 365 days, soldiers fought on average for 240, and the average age of the deceased did not even reach 23 years. This war was a disgrace for the USA, but how its veterans managed to adapt to civilian life deserves respect. See you in the next videos, friends.